Good afternoon, good morning. I don't know where exactly you're listening, but basically we are back for a small space. This small space would regard something I wanted to do for a while, but I couldn't get basically the time and also the argument to do it just because it wouldn't matter. It's in the past. It regards the absolute fiasco of the Istanbul negotiations and what is currently being peddled, especially by Yaroslav Trofimov, regarding the supposed breakdown of these negotiations. If you guys want to know more what it is about, you just need to head up to Trofimov, his actual page. You will see two things. First of all, he has defending a point of view that is absolutely wrong. Not as much as what happened within the negotiations, but about the military circumstances of the breakdown of these negotiations. Well, what does Trofimov says? I'm going to find the page. So, and the page is, I have it. I'm posting it so you can read it. And it's very simple. Our friend is pretending that there was never an agreement, that the Russians had jumped the shark, and that Bucha changed everything. Now, actually, if you start reading the paper, there are a couple of things. They're going to say, like, on March 10, Kuleba flew to the Turkish resort of Antalya to meet his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, for the first encounter. Asked Lavrov simple questions behind the closed doors. In Antalya, Mr. What do you want? That's all I want to know. Kuleba recalled. Lavrov didn't reply, launching instead to the usual Russian litany of allegations that Ukraine had turned Nazi, blah, blah, blah. In the 90 days between the talks, so basically from the Antalya meeting and the start of the operation, Trofimov said that the military situation had turned into Ukraine's advantage. This is the first false allegation. In the 90 days after 24th, actually the military situation remained extremely precarious for Ukraine. First of all, the attack was in a sense hadn't happened yet. It would arrive around the 14th of March, which would be actually a turning point, but it wasn't there yet. Second of all, Ukrainians were preparing to actually counter in Nikolaev and in Kherson. The 16th of March would be officially the counterattack in Kherson, which would repel the Russians for about 20 kilometers from the outskirts of Nikolaev towards Kherson, and would lock the front line around the Ingulets or Ingul, whatever you want to call it. The 16th of March, you're going to have the attack on Kherson International Airport, which would cause extensive damage to the Russian helicopter fleet, and also a couple of strikes around it that would cause extreme damage to the VDV units that were actually preparing to assault the Nikolaev airport. But the 10th of March, there was not anything of the case. From the 10th to roughly the 19th of March, especially in the north, despite extremely bloody battles, Ukrainians were recalling everywhere. Most importantly, the Chernigov bridge was blown. One of the two Chernigov bridges was blown the 22nd of March, and the city was literally a lame sitting duck. There were other causes for concern for the Russians. Basically, the Brovary axis of attack wasn't working. They had been having huge issues around the Trostanis area as well, and also the advance towards Kharkov was literally stuck at Chuguiv. They pressed until Star Salto, but basically they were stuck in Chuguiv. So that by the 10th of March, unironically, the Russians were in control. They had losses. They had a complete shit show in other parts. Sumy was, in a sense, catastrophe was going to come. But at the 10th of March, the situation was extremely bad. Now, we could see, we can also speak about the 19th day between Antalya and Istanbul. But that's exactly where Trofimov is betraying his hand. What he's saying is that Ukraine sat on the table because they were losing and they were afraid to lose a lot more, which is true. The whole point of the Ukrainian delegation there was to stall as much as they could and offer the Russians a glimpse of potential, I'd say, victory with the premises that Putin wanted in the beginning. Now, the 16th, you have the counterattack in Kherson. You have 2 days before the complete fiasco in Voznitsensk, lack of encirclement, lack of bypassing of Nikolaev, no encirclement of Nikolaev, no taking over the airfield at Voznitsensk. And you know the story. First stalling, end of March. Second stalling, end of April. And then you got this back and forth all over Kherson, which stays roughly until the month of August. However, if we continue this, battlefield situation shift dramatically in Ukraine's favor. Actually, that's not the case. What happened is that while Russians decided not to incur the risks of over-investing in the northern area, while simply not having the means to, I have said this multiple times, attacking Kiev would have required a second army from the one that attacked Ukraine in February 2022, because the city is huge. It's a 3.5 million city. Even if half of it is emptied, you are dealing with 1.7, 1.8 million city. Huge extents. That was also one of the biggest problems that the Russians had when they tried to encircle the city with the forces they had, is that the city had been preparing in certain ways for a encirclement. This most probably due to the fact that they had perfect ISR against the Russians on the ground, and they had also the means to have a close combat posture into defeating the Russians piecemeal. This, of course, isn't as simple as that. The Ukrainians incurred a lot of losses defending Kiev and the area, but this is the funny part. They succeeded into keeping the communication lines open between both sides of Kiev, so over the Dnipro. This, of course, was a major mistake on the Russian side, not blowing up the bridges, not flooding the Alma of Kiev city by blowing up the dam, while the Ukrainians literally flooded the European flood plain in order to stop them from going on both sides, although the impact was exaggerated because, as I said, trying to cross along the European flood lines would have simply made most of the Russians crossing around the flood plain, sitting ducks, basically. This is not important. What is important is what comes next. So we read the continuation of this pretense of an argument. As Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan opened the Istanbul talks on March 29, the mandate of the Ukrainian team was to push for Russian withdrawal to pre-invasion lines while showing openness on many key issues, with actual decisions transferred to a planned meeting between Zelensky and Putin. So basically, Ukrainians were there just to stall as much as possible in order for whatever was going on militarily to happen. This, of course, has three main aspects and goes back to what I said a couple of times last year already, but this year as much as I can. The Putin's Goals were probably of three levels. Maximalist goals, the Ukrainians actually completely fold. You impose a piece of paper they're going to sign. You shrink the army. You occupy a large swath of the country. You install a transition, whatever regime, by having Zelensky, of course, being humiliated, because that's the funny part. And then you withdraw slightly after basically destroying everything that you needed, including by looting them. So basically, you go to Yuzhmash, you fucking bolt up the fucking factory. You go to Motor Sich, you bolt up everything you have. You go to Kharkov, you destroy it. Exactly what they did for a part of Georgia once they had the war with Georgia. This is the maximalist option. At no point Putin wants to change the government right away, because that's the problem. Once you change the government and put whatever crony in there, you are going to risk a lot more problems. The point is to have the same government on the spot, execute, and go to the end of the agreements you imposed on them. Of course, it's an imposition. Once again, we are not speaking here about consensual agreement. You lose via victis. Point. Second level of, I'd say, transactional goals for Putin was basically, we threaten Kiev, you decide to give us the strict minimum we're asking you, and that strict minimum, as I said, is no NATO, smaller army, neutral state, and you start making modifications to your constitution, the Ukrainian constitution, in order to allow for no EU membership, no NATO membership, and a different treatment for Russian ethnics. This is the transactional level. Transactional level means that we have something that you need from us, while you have going to give us what we need from you in order to get back what you had. What the Russians had within 2 to 3 weeks was the land bridge to Crimea, still the capacity to threaten the southern Ukraine. This, of course, changed dramatically after the start of the Kherson counter-offensive, middle of March 2022. But still, what happened. And also the fact that Russia had advanced extremely hard on the Lugansk Oblast, and they were threatening a couple other points in the Donetsk Oblast. Volnovaka fell. You had advanced towards Rubizhno and Popasna, and so on and so on and so on. Now, this is the second level, transactional. So basically, I'm not keeping what I just conquered. I'm giving them back to you. But you need to give me back something. And that, as I said, would be small army, neutral state, constitutional changes, no NATO, of course, no EU, of course, and probably a couple of investment deals that would basically put Ukraine into a subservient state towards Russia. Once again, you may think that this is like me being harsh on Russia. No, I'm being real. I'm always being real on that. And this war for me has nothing to do. We joke and we mock Ukrainians, and sometimes you go even too far with Timor criminal, THD, whatever. But the reality, in my reality at least, is that this is a security matter. So you are playing hardball with these guys. I'm completely understanding what Russians are trying to do here. And honestly, if that was applied to my own country, I would feel extremely slighted. At least, so be it. But the logic is what it is. And in our history in the Balkans and Serbian, Bosnia, Macedonian, Croatian, Slovenian friends know this pretty well, although they don't want to accept it. We had the Ottomans do to us generally the exact thing with different flavors, which contributed to what we had at the end of the 20th century as a problematic situation. So on that aspect, I'm not judging the Russians are being good or bad. They are just applying their own security terms, the same way any overbearing power would do with its near abroad. That's it, point. So in this case, you got the first maximalist option, didn't work. Transactional option didn't work either. So Putin just literally went to the exact thing that actually Trofimov likes to forget, which is they went into a conquest and keeping mode. By the moment they achieved their core goals, basically Crimean land bridge, a better approach to our Donetsk outskirts so they could push forward. That's exactly what they said basically in May. We are going to focus on Donbass. And they achieved something rather interesting very quickly in 2022 either, because by April they started their operation in Lugansk, and by July they had completely taken over the Lugansk Oblast while still keeping large swaths of Kharkov Oblast and the whole of the Kherson Oblast. Zaporizhzhia was still more or less at the same level, between 72 and 75%. So the outlook in July for Russia, in absolute terms, was great. They were very close to closing their own deal. Their own deal was basically 23 to 25% Zaporizhzhia. Of course, it was going to be a problem pushing forward. That's a given. And they were holding about 55 to 56% of the Donetsk Oblast, and they could basically focus on the rest of the Donetsk Oblast, given that they so thought had the approaches and the buffer zone on the Kharkov Oblast under control. The problems arrived when the Ukrainians got replenished with long-range missile attacks in May and June. These ones actually allowed the Ukrainians to, first of all, be able to concentrate their fire on the two very problematic logistical routes along the Kherson area. So every bridge got its fair share of strikes. The Antonovsky Bridge, Antonovsky Railway Bridge, the Novokharkovka Dam and its adjacent road, and the small Kharkovka Railway Bridge was also hit. So almost threatening the Russians by being severed on the wrong bank of the Dnieper in the Kherson Oblast. However, this situation, by the way, I told back the day that the Russians had the choice to make: either fight like demons and lose the whole Kherson Oblast because the forces would be stuck on the other side, and basically Ukrainians were going to ask the Russians who were encircled in Kherson Oblast beyond the Dnieper to surrender, and in order to get maybe 15,000-20,000 troops pull back towards Crimea, or they were going to do the smartest thing and fighting a delay battle for as long as they could, evacuate most of their troops, and then keep most of the Kherson Oblast. So this is what actually happened. What we didn't know by then is that the Russians knew since the month of April, May, that Kherson city was a done deal, long range. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that they were expecting that the Americans would deliver HIMARS, which means that there were other ways to discuss the weapon supplies. And the most important thing is that for a weapon to be supplied in May 2022, the discussions, preparations, and the shipment must have been envisioned by March 2022, at least, if not before. So that's why I'm going so far and coming back to what Trofimov is saying, is that, by the way, if Ukrainians knew they were going to get HIMARS soon enough, for them it was just a matter of holding as much as they could, throwing as much meat as they could to the Russians, pushing them back, and then they had a plan to go slowly against Russian lines and Russian supply lines. This means that by March 29, and if you read a bit later in the article, you have Boris Johnson, who says, "I was a bit worried at that stage," Johnson recalled. "I could not see for the life of me what the deal could be, and I thought that any deal with Putin was going to be pretty sordid. Sitting down with Zelensky, the British Prime Minister delivered his speech. Nobody can be more Ukrainian than Ukrainians. It is not for me to tell you what your war objectives can be, but as far as I'm concerned, Putin must fail, and Ukraine must be entitled to retain full sovereignty and independence. We're not directly fighting. You are. It's the Ukrainians who are fighting and dying, but we would back Ukraine 1,000%. Zelensky didn't mean much convincing. The conversation quickly shifted to provision of military supplies. The first trickle in what would become a fluid, increasing sophisticated Western weapons. Meanwhile, online talks between Ukraine and Russian teams fizzled away. So, this logic of Bucha caused HIMARS, HIMARS caused the acceleration of the war, and there was never a deal, is actually wrong. Most importantly, is wrong because it's not only HIMARS that came by. You had howitzers, we had 777 Lotto Bingos that came by, and the ammunition to fire them. Of course, training on a howitzer is not very, very difficult. It can be done pretty easily. It's few specifics for the 777 that would be different from the 2S 19 or whatever howitzer, self-propelled, not self-propelled, doesn't matter. But the thing is that you can train someone on the fly with a howitzer. It's going to be a lot more difficult with HIMARS. And this means that if we keep what the Americans have declared as time to train the Ukrainians, which is about 2 months, this means that the first Ukrainians on HIMARS were trained in March. So before Bucha was known. It's as simple as that. So the whole logic of Trofimov saying that Bucha caused, or Zelensky saying Bucha caused HIMARS and caused also the collapse of the talks, it's absolutely bullshit. And we're going to say something else because that's something that Trofimov also addresses in his message about Mariupol. Mariupol saw a lot more destruction, a lot more civilian death, and a lot more wrongdoings by both sides. We had footage of both, like we had a Ukrainian TWK falling in the middle of a residential neighborhood. We had Ukrainian artillery being hidden into storages, firing against DNR and Russian Marines. We had Russians bombing whole building areas with dumb bombs. We had Russian Iskander use around the Mariupol port, which honestly, despite every kind of precision, was still a large trace of destruction. We had Ukrainian / Russian, call it as you want, civilians trying to flee, being blocked. There were numerous episodes that were way worse than Bucha. So saying that Bucha is causing these discussions to collapse is absolutely nonsense. It is all the more nonsense that we have atrocities against soldiers and locals on both sides from day one. We have kids trying to throw Molotovs on Russian patrols in Kherson being gunned down like dogs. We have pro-Russian civilians being killed by Ukrainian civilians or Ukrainian military dressed as civilians. We have perfidy done to the Russian troops right away in Kharkov. So when we speak about all these things, when we speak about how Bucha is this quintessential breakdown in morale and in war rules, whatever, this is nonsense. This is absolute nonsense. So what really happened? What really happened is very simple. Ukrainians are turning the tide, and they are convinced they're going to get weapons behind it, so they keep going at it. They keep going at it. They have launched their counteroffensive in Kherson. They have basically gotten back most of their north by doing jack squat. Chernigov area, Sumy area are completely cleared by Russian troops simply by going away. Russians are deciding that it's not worth with their reduced amount of troops to try and do something that from the beginning looked like a show of force, which cost them dearly, by the way, and they are just fucking pulling out. And you know that during the pullout, a couple of war crimes were also committed. We have seen the images both in Malarohan, in Dmitrievka outside of Kiev, a couple of other things around Chernigov, and all of this happened despite the Russians literally saying they were retreating, and Ukrainians coming back said, we never said that you could retreat without being affected." So what exactly is Trofimov talking about? That the Russians have come there just to impose their will. The Russians have not come there to impose their will. As I said, there is a triple level here, and the Russians have understood that the first maximalist level is not going to work. But if the maximalist level is not going to work, then how are the Russians going to impose their will on the Ukrainians? And then the answer is to be found, as I said, to the second level, so the transactional negotiation. We are holding about 25 to 30% of your territory right now. We're giving you back a little bit as a gesture of goodwill. Yes, the joke is there. You can meme as much as you want. You're giving you back some of it, but we're gonna attack you on the other side if you don't give us what we want. This also turned a little bit sore because despite a evident success in Luhansk and a situation in July that looked absolutely great for Russia, despite the losses in Kiev and Chernigov, its actual main goals, taking away most of the east and making sure that the Ukrainians are stuck fighting in areas where it would be a lot easier for Russia to have logistics and sustain the transfer, of course, made sense. There too, Russia would actually pay a lack of attention, a lack of preparedness. We have said this much, and I think the Russian leadership, Russian military leadership, for sure, in around the month of March and April, understood that a couple of things that I said. First of all, that trailing was in a sense, so no encirclement of Nikolaev. So basically, in short term, maybe a stalemate on Kherson, but given enough time, given the fact that the Ukrainian military now would have a shorter front to defend, could better prioritize resources towards the south, Zaporizhia, and the east. This is exactly what happened. They first tried their hand at the fresh front in Kherson. Why in Kherson? Because the Russians had not yet dug in. If you see some of the images of Russian artillery battery destruction, the guys are literally lined up as it was a parade. If you compare those images to what you see now, even when they get hit, you got dugouts, you got concealments, you got a completely different approach. And that's also why the Ukrainians are now forced mostly to use HIMARS against these positions. It's a completely different ballgame. And this is what I'm saying, that actually the Bucha didn't play any real role. As a PR catalyst, yes, for sure. But the reality is that Ukrainians had already made up their mind, especially when Kiev didn't fall, and they were sure, given American intelligence, that the Russians could not afford a 3,000 kilometer front. This was as much said by Arakamia more recently. This was said by Azov representatives more recently. This was said by terrorists from Kiev more recently. And they all say the same. We knew that the Russians could not afford that big of a front, despite the fact that they had the material for it. They didn't have the troops, and they wanted a very short action up north and a short action up south. And from what Arakamia said, negotiation, we give you back what you took from you, but you changed your constitution and you agree to give us Crimea and give us at least the two oblasts in the east, Donetsk, Lugansk. So all this premise that somehow, the Russians were there to impose their will on Ukrainians is actually both true and false. Of course, Russians are there to make Ukrainians abide by some promises that were made in a completely different circumstance and a different complete context, which was 2014, 2015, where the Russians enjoyed a complete domination, localized domination over Ukraine. In 2022, this complete domination over Ukraine still existed, but the problem is that now they were facing face to face with a military and a country that unarguably this time were going to fight. What happened in 2014 is literally the ragtag force prepared for the ATO that was supposed to last 48 hours was first stalled, then was advancing extremely slowly. So basically from June to July, the DNR, LNR forces, first under Girkin, who was an absolute moron, and his military prowess did that. And then under the control of local plus commanders plus GRU/Wagner guys, made the Ukrainian forces stall as much as they could until actually force prepared in Russia plus Russian military came through and not only saved the day but caused an absolute disaster for the Ukrainian military. If you see the amount of losses in about 3 weeks that Ukrainians incurred in August and September 2014, we are speaking about Rabutin on steroids proportionally. So it was so bad that Poroshenko literally said in September, we lost 65% of the vehicles and assets that we engaged. It was just fucking murder. 2015, when it was time to both solve the Svitlodar salient and the surrounding of the Donetsk airport also happened. Ukrainians were still no match. It was harder, of course, and forces were slightly different, but they were still no match for it. Now, the biggest problem when it comes to 2022 is that, as I said, while the Russians would have a superiority in arms for a large area of things, they're playing away. And I've already explained that in multiple threads. Biggest problem that Ukrainians pose to the Russians is that in this game of front field, backfield, Russians were playing with almost no backfield. Their lines from their starting point were between 70 and 80 kilometers minimum, while Ukrainian lines were between 30 and 45 kilometers. So this meant that they could better compartmentalize their supply lines. They could better counteract. They had better general ISR. They had a better understanding of using drones for recon, although we know that the Russians were also not completely devoid of that, but not at the same level they are right now. And also, the whole plan for the Russian troops was to fight an army. For a long time, there was no Ukrainian army to fight. This is best illustrated by what happened in the south. For 2 weeks, the Russians could do whatever they want, from Armyansk to basically Nikolaev. And then things changed. Why? Because their supply lines stretched. There weren't enough. The plan was to, as I said, try to circumvent Nikolaev, take over the Voznesensky airfield, and then hit back towards the other side of Nikolaev, encircle the city, make a buffer zone towards Yuzhny and Odessa, and it was done. On paper, great plan. But the assets given, the kind of resistance, and the type of war that they envisioned was completely wrong. Ukraine, by some miracle, could literally field on top of its standing army of about 145,000 people, probably at least 60 to 70,000 more, right away. And as such, a lot of foreign volunteers actually allowed the Ukrainians to have a backline. So have a secondary, tertiary line where they would need to actually have them manned by Ukrainian people, and everyone who could fight, could speak Russian or Ukrainian, was at the front. And we see that with both a lot of memoirs from the International Gay Legion of Ukraine, and also from people who were supposed to put them into a cadre and to a Ukrainian frame. These guys would come behind the actual Ukrainian troops. Very few would be at the front lines. There would be skirmish or whatever you want to call, but most of the heavy fight would be done by Ukrainian artillery and foreign intelligence, of course. Now, let's go back to Trofimov. And the most important part that we need to actually read here is this part. In the Kremlin, Putin was certain that Washington, rather than London, had forced Zelensky to abandon talks in the hope of exhausting Russia in the protracted war. Senior Russian officials kept angrily raising the point in meetings with counterparts. Utter bullshit, a senior Biden administration official told me. Now, you need to understand, when you read this basic denial is absurd. It's absurd because most of the military aid comes from the US. The most important tools of Ukrainian survival come from the US. This logic that a puppet of the United States, a poodle like Johnson, would be far more convincing to Zelensky than the prospect from the United States of a transfer of HIMARS, of more javelins, more ammunition, artillery, which was starting to be a huge problem for Ukrainians around the month of May. I'm sorry, all this, just check where you are fucking eating. Here Trofimov is literally inventing something and being credulous enough, which I know he isn't. This is just like rubbing it to the face of the Russians, that supposedly Boris Johnson was quintessential into forcing, or at least turning the Ukrainians to fight. Once again, as I said, just rewind what happened. They started the counteroffensive in Kherson at mid-March. This counteroffensive was having effect. They had 10 kilometers of pushback within 2 weeks. The situation was becoming dire. They had their first successes next to Alexandrivka in the Mykolaiv Oblast. They were trying to push towards Kherson Oblast. Then had to be pushed back. But all these things, all this circle of fighting means that Ukrainians knew pretty much what they wanted. So the stalling by end of March and the continuation of the war has nothing to do with Bucha. And has also nothing to do with we're keeping this war going because we're winning. Ukrainians knew precisely well that what they were calling victories were actually extremely costly battles, that at some point, and we had this explanation by June when the head of logistics on the Ukrainian side said, literally, we need another army. And there we are. We are back to this lie that Russians wanted to impose everything, nothing could be agreed. And on a completely legalistic point of view, it's true. Nobody can force the Ukrainians to abandon their territory. Nobody can force the Ukrainians to change the constitution, and nobody can force the Ukrainians to do anything. But then there is no way to try and put Bucha up front and try to say that Russians are forcing you. You are having a war with them. Of course, they are trying to impose your conditions, but they are not accepting your capitulation. The Russians, by the 29th, they knew perfectly what they had at their hand, given the fact that had decided to go on with the quote-unquote goodwill gesture. And the fact that they are complaining to the US, you are dragging this way beyond what is supposed to happen, which also would reflect pretty poorly on the Russian leadership, because suddenly Putin had run his mouth like brotherly nation, and there is this disease in Kiev that we need to take out. And suddenly what is going on, it's not like a gentle takeover from big brother to small brother, to younger brother. It's literally an ex-Yugoslav war. For people who know me, who have followed me, I said it straight up. What Putin thinks he's doing is completely wrong. This has ex-Yugoslav vibes. And this is unsettled business from 1991, 1992, 1994, 1995 for Crimea and Donbass. But this is unsettled business, and this is people who thought that they could stay friends forever, while the basis of both nationalism, the basis of both national narratives, Russian and Ukrainian, is the opposition of one another. And you can have this on the language, on the historical figures, on the historical narrative that was built up. Holodomor, I think, is the best example. You would see that Holodomor affected as much Russians, and even ethnic Russians, Kazakhs, every single nationality was busy with agriculture, suffered greatly under Holodomor, which was a absolutely appalling, typically communist, short-sighted method to both bring a class or a strata of population under central heel, but also create the ecosystem in which the communists would thrive by completely obliterating all these populations and constituting the central leadership as the Kandari, as the judge of conditioning on both sides, the infamous Stalin fabric of peoples. That's exactly what happened. Yet for the Ukrainians, the Holodomor was a Russian instigated genocide. For Russians, the Holodomor was an absolute aberration done by the communists that affected them, the Ukrainians, Kazakhs, and a lot of other auxiliary ethnicities within the Soviet Union. This differentiation in lecture of a historical fact is exactly what I'm saying, that people who decided in 1991 that it would be completely fine not to solve a couple of both historical, ethnical, and social situations within these countries, and we're speaking about Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, did exactly what didn't happen in Yugoslavia. And that thing lasted at least a decade with the Kosovo War, and even a bit later with the Macedonian uprising. Of course, Albanians trying to force the Macedonian state to basically afford them stuff that nobody wanted to give them, including the Europeans. So all this situation, all this logic that Putin completely misjudged, miscalculated, misplanned, and miscommunicated, because this is the thing as well. The Russians started by communicating some bullshit like goodwill gesture. Bro, you just failed. There were other ways to present that goodwill gesture. That was not saving grace. I have a completely different view. What should have been said is that literally we try to solve this with the minimal bloodshed possible. It didn't happen. Ukrainians want war because they hate us. I would literally want like that. Instead of having this bullshit that, yes, in the light of goodwill gesture of cooperation, whatever. No, 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 no. This is one of the things that Russians need to learn right now. It is saying the truth. Not the truth that people consider as the truth. No, the truth based on their situation, their point of view. The truth is, and I've said it, Russia as a market, as a state, as a territory, as a nation, right now, is being cornered. Ukraine is near abroad. Ukraine has always been intertwined with Russia. We are not speaking historical, ethnical bullshit. No, I'm saying Kharkov couldn't produce yet any tanks without input from Russia. Russia couldn't fix most of its helicopters until 2013 without input from Ukraine. This is the intertwining. This is the historical background. This is the historical logic here. Russia, of course, Putin said a couple of these things, but these are not how he said them. Telling people the truth by saying what they have, we built, and what we have, they were part of. It's very simple. There are things that unfortunately the Russian state right now cannot afford and cannot say. And this, I think, is what is causing a lot more trouble than it should. So if Putin was smart, and he is actually smart, but unfortunately there is a rhetoric, there is a ecosystem of pretenses that both sides have built. Putin would have gone straight up for the truth. We tried to reason with him by not applying maximum violence. We failed. Now we're going to something completely different. Of course, he didn't need to declare war. The fact is, he still hasn't declared war, and they're literally making Ukraine look already like fucking Somalia in certain areas. But by taking that step and by putting the Russian people in front of the seriousness of the situation for Russia, as I said, as a territory, as a nation, as a market as well, as an entity, is what also allows a lot of people within Russia, a lot of liberals, so-called liberals, pro-Western people, to be able to say, oh, see, if you were with the West, nothing would happen. Putin is a liar. Putin is an autocrat. Putin is a dictator. Of course, you could sit with these people, start looking at graphs, pointing out that for the last 20 years, Russia tried to actually enjoy her competitive advantage. It was never granted to her. The foreign direct investment from 2008 to 2013 towards Russia was lower than around Germany, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, Czech Republic. Fuck, even Romania has had more FDI than Russia. All those countries, all 5 of them, have maybe a market of 90 million people. Russia was 140, 150, and nobody tried to actually invest in Russia. What Russia was good for was to be plundered. And it's logical. It's a huge bounty. It's a loot box, let's say it like this. Gas, oil, steel. For people who know how to handle that area, Russia is a perfect place. And Ukraine was a extension of Russia for so long. So if Putin was to be a lot more, I'd say, forthcoming with the reasons why Russia is doing this, I think a greater part of the Russian population would understand the situation right now. Because right now the situation has gone into something different. And we're going towards what Trofimov is peddling here in his piece, which is they hate us, we hate them. Russians just don't consider, Russians wouldn't care less right now for the economic structure of Ukraine. Yeah, it's a nice market, but at the end, that market is a threat to the Russian market, so that's why they're destroying it. Yeah, it's common people, but they are a threat to us, so we're destroying them. If you have the comparison between ex-Yugoslavia and Russia and Ukraine, you can see where it is. You can see where it goes. Common culture. We're not speaking about a artificial regime like the Soviet Union. We're speaking about people living together in the fucking same place for ages, having jokes against each other, culture against each other, with each other. These are the things that, once again, I'm going to repeat, these are the things that Putin has failed into addressing from the beginning, and that allow people like Trofimov to make up shit like, oh, but they were there to impose themselves. In strict terms, yes, they are waging war, so of course they're going to make demands in order for them to stop destroying you. But at no point the Russians had envisioned this capitulation post 15th of March. And I think overall, given the request that both sides are agreeing to now, so Arakami is saying they don't want us in NATO, don't want us in EU, and all the rest, all these rights were just fucking dress up for the people. What they want is no NATO, no EU, and smaller army. If these are the capitulation requests from Russia, god damn it, man. I hope whoever convinced Zelensky to go to war, I hope that person rots in hell. And yeah, basically that was the space right now. I just wanted to have this discussion and have this space because I have this huge problem right now when people are busy rewriting almost everything about this war. Bye, guys.